So during one of the greatest eras of mixed martial arts, which was 2016, Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor were at the front cover of the EA Sports UFC 2 game, of which a lot of people claim and have speculations of possible curses of when, let's say, athletes or fighters that are featured in this video game end up losing. Now, that is a reality that happened with Conor McGregor after 2016 and Ronda Rousey in her two-fight losing streak after her undefeated streak that she had going on, which was snapped by Holly Holmes, and then later on got a title shot against none other than Amanda Nunes, coming off of a loss, maybe granted because of the fact that she was such a dominant figure in mixed martial arts, especially in the women's division. Well, now we got a situation with Israel Adesanya and Jorge Masvidal, which are the two latest covers of UFC EA Sports. And weirdly enough, in some of the new updates that they have going on, they sort of replaced Israel Adesanya with Alex Pereira, because in their last fight that they had going on, that's literally what they did. They were like, the winner of this fight is going to be the cover of EA Sports UFC game. And now that's what happened. Jorge Masvidal, where you shouldn't really be surprised about all this, right? Because you ever heard the term journeyman George and the way that Colby Covington describes Jorge Masvidal? It's not really that far-fetched, because prior to Jorge Masvidal becoming a superstar, he won fights, he lost fights, he won fights and lost fights. Basically what most journeymen in mixed martial arts go through. Not in the way that, let's say, boxing journeymen go through, where they have 20 losses in a row and then maybe a few times here and there they get a few wins and that. But nonetheless, Jorge Masvidal became a star when he knocked out Darren Till in London, and then followed up with a knockout against Ben Askren, who, by the way, was red hot coming into the UFC. If you guys don't remember, all the hardcore fans remember this, there was a time where Ben Askren was considered the guy to potentially beat George St. Pierre and all these other top 170-pound fighters in the UFC, because he was undefeated at ONE FC and Bellator, and then was an All-American and Olympic wrestling competitor. So he had all these credentials and this and that. And then he came into the UFC, had an awesome debut against Robbie Lawler, nearly got knocked out, got slammed on his head, only to come back and choke Robbie Lawler out. Well, now he earned a fight against Jorge Masvidal, in which Jorge Masvidal knocked him out in 5 seconds after such a crazy promo they had going back and forth, trash talking each other, talking smack here and there. And then all of a sudden, Jorge Masvidal knocks him out and mocks him as he was laid out on the floor. And that only rose to the popularity of Jorge Masvidal, and then he goes on to fight Nate Diaz afterwards, in which Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal are fighting in front of Donald Trump. By the way, one of the few and only mixed martial arts events that a president of the United States has ever attended. And by the way, shout outs to Donald Trump, because as you guys know, right now he's going through an indictment while we're recording this particular episode right now. So it was great for mixed martial arts, and it was great for Jorge Masvidal's brand that he was able to have Donald Trump attend his fight that he's headlining against a legend like Nate Diaz. And then here we are. Now, years later, just like with any other combat sports there's always this aspect of where you rise up to the top and then you fall back down, and that's just the reality of it. Now, that's something that a lot of boxing heads can't wrap their heads around, because they believe that all of their fighters and their favorite guys in the business are somehow going to stay undefeated for the rest of their lives, or maybe if they have 1 or 2 losses, they come back and then they just beat everybody else. But nonetheless, when you're in the UFC, you are constantly taking on the best fighters in the world. Now, surprisingly enough, the way that Alex Pereira came into the business and came into the UFC rather, well, the business of mixed martial arts altogether, was because, let's face it, he knew that Israel Adesanya made a big splash in the UFC, becoming a top contender, beating legends like Anderson Silva, having these big fights with Kelvin Gastelum, and then having another big fight in Australia against Robert Whittaker, and then fighting him twice and becoming a champion, and thinking to himself, I beat this guy in kickboxing, and he's beating everybody in this business through kickboxing with barely any grappling. So he thought, you know what, maybe I should try my luck in this sport, and lo and behold, he becomes another Brock Lesnar Lomachenko in the sport of mixed martial arts and in the UFC league, because he was able to win the title within less than maybe, a couple of fights. Within just a year, he was able to win the title against his nemesis rival, Israel Adesanya. Well, prior to that, Israel Adesanya was a big star. He has this look about him. He's from New Zealand. He's from Nigeria. So he covers all these two worldly spectrums of regions that are very important in the mixed martial arts market. For example, you have a guy who's from Nigeria, so Africa is a big deal for the UFC at the current moment. And then the fact that he's from New Zealand, in the South Pacific, in Australia, and New Zealand, and all these other areas in that part of the world, it was a vital interest for the UFC. On top of that, let's talk about the fact that Israel Adesanya is the type of guy that is extremely marketable. It's like as if this guy grew up in the United States or grew up in the Bronx with his hip-hop swag and the way that he carries himself and the way that he's all in tune into the culture. So he's a very viable person in the UFC market in that aspect. Well, now, just like with any other sport, in a sport where you are fighting the best and constantly fighting the best, he loses, right? Because this is a guy that has had his number, a guy that he has fought in kickboxing several times, and now he fought him in mixed martial arts, has a win over him, and now he has a chance to redeem himself this weekend. Jorge Masvidal, the same thing. He's now fighting somebody like Gilbert Burns, who, by the way, a lot of people are looking at this matchup saying to themselves that Gilbert Burns is going to run through Jorge Masvidal with absolute ease. And why are people saying that? Well, for the simple fact that you look at the performances of Gilbert Burns in the past, it's remarkable. But the reason why they're really looking at Jorge Masvidal as a victim for Gilbert Burns coming up is the fact that he put Khamzat through the ringer. Now, we got to take into consideration. So we are in Ramadan at the current moment of time right now, right? When Khamzat fought Gilbert Burns, it was during Ramadan at UFC 273 of last year. It was last year's Ramadan. Khamzat Chimaev was fighting during Ramadan, and a lot of people don't take that into consideration. They look at the fact that, yes, there were plenty times in that fight where Khamzat Chimaev was compromised, was hurt, was rocked, and made a lot of mistakes. And one can argue a lot of that has to deal with the fact that he was fasting for Ramadan while on fight day. Now, who does that? Who fights on Ramadan? And I've always said that, you know what, Khabib will never fight in Ramadan, right? He's claimed this. We all know this. This is common public knowledge. Now, prior to UFC 273, when Gilbert Burns fought Khamzat Chimaev, I always said to myself, if there is one guy in the entire sport of Muslim mixed martial arts, I think Khamzat would be the only guy that can possibly fight during Ramadan. And why do I say that? Well, let's take a look at the way that he's built, right? He's built in a way where he's lean. He's got strong, lean muscles and something to that effect, to where I think that type of body type can handle a little bit of famine, can handle a little bit of starvation, but still be able to perform at a certain level. Now, you look at Khabib, the way that he's built, very muscular, very shroud, very huge, very bulky in that sort of matter, but also very explosive and athletic in that same circumference. So you got to understand, a guy with that kind of body type, what he has going on is that he needs 100% nutrition. He needs to have, the best possibilities and the best possible situations for him to be able to perform, right? So he needs to have all the right nutritions in order to get his body to perform in a way that he needs to, in a way that he needs to lift guys up, in a way that he needs to slam him. Now, when Khamzat Chimaev, he can fast during Ramadan and fight because of the fact that, well, let's just say that the way that he's built, like I said, he has a body type that is built for famine and starvation and can still go on, right? Sort of like a special forces type of body type that can handle these things. Whereas Khabib, he's more of like an athlete that needs all this nutrition and food sustenance in order for him to perform in the way that he does. Okay, so it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you in a certain kind of way to where you've seen the Gilbert Burns fight. It really affected him. So are we looking at Gilbert Burns as somebody that put Khamzat Chimaev through some of the toughest ringers in Khamzat Chimaev's life and career? Yes, but we also don't look at the compromisation that came with being able to make that fight, being able to having to fast during Ramadan and yet taking on a fight like Gilbert Burns. Now, I would argue, in my humble opinion, that if Khamzat was to fight Gilbert Burns in any other circumstances outside of Ramadan, I think he would absolutely starch him, if not dominate all 3 rounds with ease, because of the baseline that we've seen out of Khamzat Chimaev in all his last fights, the way that he fought Kevin Holland, the way that he fought all these guys in his debut during the Abu Dhabi Fight Island days of 2020. Well, now you look at Gilbert Burns fighting Jorge Masvidal, I think it's a lot more even than people think. It's even so long as Jorge Masvidal is able to stuff the takedowns and not get taken to the ground and not allow Gilbert Burns to work his submission game. So if he's able to do that, then I think that we're going to see an even fight, but also a fight that possibly Jorge Masvidal can win. Now, with Israel Adesanya, is this a fight that he can win against Alex Pereira? Yes, 100%. Both of these guys have each other's number. It just so happened that Alex Pereira was the guy to land the knockout shot and end the fight the way that it did in order for him to be victorious. Other than that, these guys are very dead even. This is why this fight is very compelling in the way that it is. You've seen in the first fight, Israel Adesanya was able to knock down Alex Pereira. So while he was able to knock him down, guess what? It was in the first round, and the bell had rung maybe around 4:59 of the last second of the round in order for him to get rocked, and then he got saved by the bell. So very even in that aspect, right? And then not to mention, the one question that we've always asked, even in the first fight, was how much of the wrestling are each of these guys going to use to implement, which makes this fight even more compelling the way that it is. Well, this particular video is not so much about the breakdowns, even though I did a few breakdowns just now of what may happen and what has happened and what you're going to expect. Now, what do you expect if, let's say, the inevitable of, let's say, Jorge Masvidal losing to Gilbert Burns? And then what would happen if, let's say, somebody like, Israel Adesanya was to lose to Alex Pereira once again? I'll tell you what would happen. What would happen is that I think their star power would not really go down that low, because right now, Israel Adesanya and Jorge Masvidal are kind of in the Conor McGregor level, which is a reason why they were on the cover of EA Sports UFC game for that simple reason and that simple fact. So because of that, you got to take into consideration that their market value is going to drop just slightly, a tiny bit, but not a lot. Now, even in an Anthony Joshua fight that we seen this past weekend, we said that they had trouble getting ticket sales and selling out the crowd and things of that nature, right? Okay, well, that's a reality. But here's a reality that we have to understand. In mixed martial arts, it is a theater of the unknown. And Whether you win or you lose, one of the biggest things that's important in this business is your marketability. And if you have your marketability, by the end of the day, that's all that really matters. But still, you got to win some fights. You don't have to win the big fights all the time, but you got to win some fights. Now, the problem is, if Israel Adesanya was to lose, he claimed that he would retire. In the same similar fashion, I think Jorge Masvidal claimed that he would retire, or I think there's rumors circulating that that's the direction and the trajectory he's going to go into if he loses this fight. Now, do I think that they should do that? No, because if Jorge Masvidal was to lose, guess what? He's always going to be a wanted fighter against Leon Edwards, because Leon Edwards wants to get that back, that little street fight they had going on in London. Israel Adesanya, he still has compelling matchups to deal with at 185. It could be Khamzat if he decides to move up at 185, possibly a number one contender match, or a match that will propel Khamzat Chimaev to justify his title shot against Alex Pereira. These are all realities that is going on. Even if Jorge Masvidal was to lose this fight, he would still be marketable. So with that in mind, what about Israel Adesanya? What about Jorge Masvidal? It is up to them on what they want to do after this fight. Now, I think that they're going to be sad after the fight if they lose, but I think the money talks and marketability talks. And guess what? I had a feeling that after the Dustin Poirier fight, Conor McGregor was going to quit and never come back, in the same similar fashion that Ronda Rousey never came back after her second knockout that she suffered against Amanda Nunes after losing her belt for the first time against Holly Holmes. But these are different fighters, these are different circumstances, and these are all part of the game. So even with all these compelling matchups that they have going on, it is up for them to decide of whether they want to continue to get this bag and continue to fight all these compelling matchups that they have going on for them in the near future. But if not, guess what? It's just part of the sport. People come and go, people become famous, and then people drop off, and then people become the cover of the sport in terms of the video game covers, magazine covers, etc. But at the same time, there's also an aspect of knowing when to quit and knowing when to save yourself from a fighting career that may be damaging you in the long run. Now, you look at Israel Adesanya, he's had over 80 kickboxing fights. Jorge Masvidal has had fights in the streets. He's had fights in the cage multiple times. He's had fights in the backyards of Miami, of which where he is going right now. And how symbolic would it be if he were to lose in his hometown in the fashion that he did? Now, granted, Gilbert Burns is also a Florida-based fighter, but in this matter, it doesn't really matter in that terms, in the way that the fans are looking at it, because it is the Jorge Masvidal show at UFC 287. Even though it's his show, you got to understand this. Let me tell you what I saw at WrestleMania during this weekend. John Cena took on this young up-and-comer. And again, I know that this is fake fighting. It's not real. But I think that there's a lot of parallels that you can draw from this. And how ironic that, of course, the UFC and the WWE are merging into one company now, which is something that you would have never expected, something out of a Twilight Zone or some kind of Demolition Man movie, to where you find out that Arnold Schwarzenegger was president. You hear Sly going, Arnold Schwarzenegger president? Oh, man. But that's why they call it the theater of the unknown, right? So back to John Cena. John Cena has been this famous guy in the WWE, was the face of the WWE, was the face of the company for a long time. And then they bring him back to go and fight this young up-and-comer in Austin Theory. And guess what? He loses in one of the biggest WrestleManias of all time, in Los Angeles, mind you. So that's why they call it the theater of the unknown, because in combat sports and in real fighting, real things happen. And guess what? That's why we love it. So all I got to say to that is enjoy the fights. And a message for Jorge Masvidal and Israel Adesanya: We don't know if you're going to win or lose this fight. Only you know, and only God knows by the end of the day. But even if you do, man, we'd love for you to stay because there's still a lot of fights left in you guys, and there's a lot of fights that you can make that are big marquee matchup that doesn't have to be title contenders or title eliminators or title fights in and of itself. You can be in that era of where Conor McGregor is at right now, where he is in the money fight era of his career, where he's not worried about fighting for titles and this and that. But one fight here and there can get you there, and money talks and BS walks, and you know how that goes in the theater of the unknown. Enjoy the fights.